We have Mr. Joachim Braun, who's the president of Process Industries ABB Group. So first of all, welcome to India. And I hope Bengaluru's weather is treating you all right, because Delhi is certainly really hot. Bengaluru is one of our more pleasant cities.
Yes.
But today he's going to talk to us about digitalization, automation trends in the process industries. What are some of the trends that he's seeing after the COVID-19 pandemic? And then, of course, he'll dwell deep into some sectors like steel, cement, and how we can reduce the carbon footprint of these sectors, and, of course, on the diversification aspects. So, first of all, very quickly, Mr. Joaquin, what are some of the key takeaways from this India visit for you, or you intend to have from this visit?
My key takeaways are primarily how quickly things develop and evolve in India. That probably never ceases to amaze me. So obviously it has been a while since I've been here the last time because of the pandemic. But in the meantime, I mean, people just kept hiring more engineers, more researchers, more programmers. So I mean, we have just inaugurated a much larger building to basically house all of these people, but then also how they have developed internally, the maturity they have gained, how they master their processes, how they have basically enlarged the scope of what they're able to do. These are really my key takeaways. It's not surprising. I mean, I'm not coming to India for the first time, but when you had a larger than usual interval, I mean, the contrast to what it looked like the last time is even larger.
Come to the digitalizations and industrial automation trends. What are some of the trends that you are seeing on these two aspects in the process industries, and especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, digitalization and industrial automation?
Yes. The pandemic, although it was of course a terrible thing, which all of us would have liked not to have, but it was an accelerator for digitalization, no doubt about it, and in every regard. It in the industrial space, it was basically convincing customers that technology, which had been out there sometimes even for quite a while, is viable, is for the benefit of our customers. And what I'm referring to here is primarily remote collaboration. Customers can benefit so much if we are able to service their installations remotely rather than having someone to drive there while basically your plant is down and you're losing tens of thousands of dollars an hour. So here we can help straight away, or even better, I mean, we can already use preventive intelligence to even identify certain critical conditions in the plant, which are typically leading to a shutdown, so we can even avoid it. We have done the most complex installation and commissioning work for greenfield plants from a distance. Customers were always suspicious about that. Can that really work? No, I prefer to have people on site. And of course, we followed their request. Once that opportunity wasn't there anymore, and that was the only way to get it done remotely by digital means, we had finally the chance to prove it even to the most skeptical customers that this is viable. So I think the pandemic, as terrible as it was and as much damage it did, it definitely accelerated the adoption of digital technology basically pretty much across the board. It heightened the acceptance with industrial customers who tend to be a bit more conservative, because if you're running, a huge plant, and if something goes wrong, it might pollute the environment. Might put people and property at harm. Of course, they have good reasons to be a bit more skeptical. But I think now we're almost stepping into a new era when it comes to the adoption of digital. And of course, on the back of that, this is also helping automation. I think what is helping automation at least as much, if not more, is the journey to sustainability. Because sustainability requires you to follow more parameters in your production, for example, emissions, to take a very easy example. It puts more constraints into your organization because you can't operate as freely as before, because your equipment, if you want to run it in a sustainable way, is subject to certain boundary conditions. So that all requires a higher degree of control over your processes And of course, when we're talking about control of industrial process, we're talking automation systems. So I think the automation system, pretty much what I said about digitalization, helped them as well. But then the next big driver for a significant increase in usage is the road to sustainability.
Right. Thank you for elaborating on those trends. But I want to know and delve a bit deeper into as to what, in your assessment, how are these disruptive technologies helping industries becoming more competitive or prepare for some unexpected challenges?
Well, every digital offering which we have has a very tangible impact on the customer operations. It might, and it's primarily either you can produce the same output with less input or more output with the same input. So it's very simply said, I mean, because they are tracking your process more closely. They are giving you insights which were previously not available. Interestingly enough, mostly based on data which you already had at hand, but you never put it to good use. Um, Competitiveness is an interesting question in this context because, as always in the economy, the early adopters will benefit. It puts them ahead of their competition. So it depends very much on the maturity of the solution, how I would answer your question. A lot of the digital for industry is still in its infancy. So the early adopters clearly get a competitive advantage. Over time, and this will lead to a massive propagation of these solutions. Over time, the rest needs to follow because otherwise you're falling behind. And I think digital, and this is what makes digital so powerful and what makes it so attractive to be in that digital space, to be a supplier of digital solutions, because we expect the adoption rates to literally explode. Typically, when we're going into pilots, we're a bit careful how much we profit. What we see now, what we promise, but what we see now is that typically we're exceeding the guarantees we're giving to customers. We're gaining more confidence in what our solutions can do, and an individual solution is typically in a 5% improvement range. But if you're adding a couple of them and it's 5 every time, I mean, then it gets really powerful. The investments are typically modest. I mean, this doesn't require huge funds either. So a lot of, particularly in the early stages, when you don't have too many reference cases, customers get this at a bargain price, and they get the huge benefits at a very low investment. Or you can spread the investment by basically making it into a subscription. So I think the obstacle to make an investment compared to some of the traditional technology is much lower as well.
Right. I think for our viewers, they'll get more clarity if we dwell a bit into some specific sectors. I'll start with the steel and the cement sector.
Yes,
Clearly, if I talk about India, this year in the budget, the government has laid heavy emphasis on infrastructure development, and it's quite important for not only just India but for countries as well in general. The post-COVID economic recovery that will be coming through infrastructure development. Now, because of this thrust, the steel and the cement sectors, they are poised to see a great
yes,
growth. Now, these are two really highly emission intensive sectors. In fact, just yesterday as we are speaking, the Ministry of Steel, Government of India asked steel manufacturers to deploy a roadmap for their to reduce their low carbon emissions. So I want to understand from you that what are the solutions that can be deployed when it comes to the steel or the cement industry to reduce their carbon footprint, make them more sustainable, and lead them towards decarbonization.
basic reason why the answer for these two is very different is for steel, at least to the largest degree, there is alternative processing technology. So the standard way of producing steel by means of blast furnaces is basically where most of the CO2 emissions are coming from, because the blast furnace is typically operated by coking coal, and this, of course, leads to a lot of CO2 emissions. The good thing for the steel industry is that there is an alternative technology called direct reduction iron, which you can, for example, operate on green hydrogen. And we have a customer in Sweden who has a pilot installation where he was also taking care of the complete value chain from the green electricity production, hydrogen production, primary metals and then the processing line in the metals. And they just sold the first batch of totally CO2 free steel to an automotive customer. So I think the steel industry, in a way, at least on a pilot scale, has already proven that you can decarbonize with existing technology. And that's great news. The flip side of this is, like I said, this isn't necessarily the mainstream of what is installed today. So it will, for example, require huge investment into this DRI technology. While it is available, it still comes at a cost. And if you're basically taking out a perfectly working blast furnace, it is, in a way, from a process point of view, it's an unnecessary investment in quotation marks. Um, but it is necessary in order to basically become more sustainable. And of course, it's a heavy polluting industry. The other challenge, and I mentioned the green hydrogen, the other challenge is that the green hydrogen needs to come from somewhere. And like I said, first of all, it requires sustainably produced electrical energy, because producing hydrogen is also very energy intensive, but you can do this by means of electricity. And of course, then the process of producing hydrogen as such. And the question is, how is that supposed to work? I don't think that we can expect steel producers to produce their own electricity and their own hydrogen. So which means that we need to build up a hydrogen infrastructure, green energy, green production facilities, and then transportation and storage, just like we've built up an infrastructure for gas and oil. And that is, of course, an investment where I guess governance and industry are still debating a bit, who has to chip in where. Um, so that is maybe, roughly speaking, the situation for the steel industry. Cement does not have the luxury of just moving to an existing alternative process to produce the same product. So I think the steel industry has that privilege, but again, it comes at a burden because it requires massive investments from probably various parties involved. Cement, on the other hand, I, I mean, there's two basic ways that can go. I mean, first of all, also with help of our technology, there's lots of ways how you can make incremental improvements to the CO2 footprint of cement within the existing process. At the same time, people are certainly putting a lot of research dollars into maybe coming up with a different process. I personally very strongly believe in the power of science. And if this is one of mankind's biggest challenges, I'm sure that there's a different way to produce cement. But honestly speaking, it hasn't been developed at scale. So for now, I guess for the next couple of years, it is really about incremental improvements in the existing process. But I'm pretty confident. I mean, it's the same thing I mentioned before. You can do 5% here, you can do 10% here. So I think you can make contributions. You don't have to wait for the scientific miracle to happen. A third alternative is, of course, always that, and I know that the cement industry doesn't like to hear that necessarily, but of course they can also become part of this. You might want to look into substitutes as well. Now, again, it is hard to imagine what might be a substitute for cement, because this is a fantastic, this is basically a fantastic way of building. But I mean, we've seen this in the history often enough. I mean, if you can't keep up with progress, I mean, something else might take over, something else we can't even think about today. That might be another way how that scientific progress might go, that it says, look, we don't really have a good idea how to produce cement in a sustainable way, but here's another thing which is equally practical at erecting buildings. Could also happen.
Right. One another sector that, of course, is another on the rise, especially after the conflict, how it has unfolded in Eastern Europe, it is the coal mining sector. Clearly, the rise of coal in recent months has shot up across the world. So, what do you have for the coal mining sector? What are the solutions that can be deployed here, considering that energy transition, at least for the time being, has taken a step back for countries, and we are back at the dirtiest fuel?
Yeah. Look, I would probably look at this a bit differently, and there's maybe a similarity with what I said about the pandemic. I think that the current crisis, the current surge in prices for oil and gas, while of course you're right in saying that it has benefited coal, I would argue that this is a short-term phenomenon, because I think as much as the pandemic was an accelerator for digital solutions, I think that this surge in the hydrocarbon prices will serve as an accelerator for sustainable ways of producing energy. And this is pretty much the known things. I mean, you will basically go into sustainable electricity generation by means of hydro, solar, wind, and the likes. And then you can basically produce alternative fuel. And my steel example, I think, already shows you what it could look like. So instead of using coking coal, you're using green hydrogen. But if you want to produce green hydrogen, you need to have sustainably produced electrical energy. I think that the current surge in prices will more lead or serve as an accelerator towards this development, which anyhow has been started already. But again, that doesn't render your statement wrong. That of course the coal industry does temporarily benefit as a very short-term available alternative, and something which a lot of countries have available locally rather than having to import it from somewhere. But I think it will turn around very quickly in favor of basically the direction which most governments anyhow have committed to basically cut out CO2 emissions and move on the sustainability journey.
Right. So you're clearly on the spectrum that sees the current situation accelerating energy transition drive. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, right. Uh, I want to ask you on diversification as well. That how can we diversify our process industries, and most importantly, why it's important.
Yeah, look, I mean, I mentioned some of the things already. One important aspect of the diversification, if you think about, I mean, let's say I was right in assuming that hydrogen is basically the next fuel of choice, because we're not only talking about steel plants, we're basically talking probably about ocean-going vessels, because you can't really operate them on a battery, because then all of the cargo space would be used up for the battery. We might be talking about large road trucks and the like. So let's just assume hydrogen will, to a large degree, substitute oil and gas. I mean, this is a massive diversification, in my view, of the process industries, because you really need to build up pretty much all of that infrastructure from scratch. There's hardly anything in terms of green hydrogen production facilities out there. I mean, we're currently talking to electrolyzer manufacturers, and we see, okay, producing that at scale, it's still in its infancy, but we're pushing hard that we see marketable, scalable solutions in the market. ABB, that's also fascinating. I mean, we have products in our own product range, even in process industries, which were traditionally used in aluminum smelters, called high power rectifiers. Well, guess what? This is now becoming a core component for the production of green hydrogen, because the rectifier is basically feeding into the electrolyzer. So you see that, with often enough, even with existing technology, sometimes with new, sometimes combining new and old technology, you already diversify into completely new areas. I mentioned this Swedish steel company where you saw a greenfield investment into steel. When was the last time we've seen this? Most of the time what we saw was overcapacity, consolidation in this industry. But these people are betting that there's going to be a demand, particularly in the consumer-driven sectors like automotive, for green steel. And they wanted to be ahead of the curve. And they are not basically bogged down by an existing installed base. They start from scratch. They went into northern Sweden, where you have ample availability of hydropower, and they invested into the whole chain, and they were the first as a newcomer company. I mean, they almost embarrassed the rest of the steel company to say, hey, we're the first to produce CO2 steel. And I think that is another kind of diversification, having maybe the same product, technically speaking, the same grade of steel, but produce CO2 neutral. I guess there's going to be a market for that. And this to me is also a new way of diversification. So the diversification is not even so much on the output, but it's on the input. How was it produced? Not what are you producing, but how have you produced it?
What's the roadmap looking for ABB uh, uh, in the next 6 months, I would say? Maybe in terms of milestones that you are seeing, or probably the challenges that you're seeing given the macroeconomic situations around the world.
My answer is, of course, referring again to my own business, Process Industries, because ABB is a pretty a diverse company in itself. I mean, first of all, what we see are markets which are booming to a large degree. We're serving the mining industry, booming. We're serving pulp and paper, benefits largely from the drive towards people ordering from home, so everything needs to put into cupboard. Hygienic paper is booming. Even metals, like I said, you see that there. I mean, even though there might not be that high demand everywhere. I mean, you mentioned India, where we see a high demand, but maybe not everywhere. But the investment will be driven more by the sustainability challenge, as we discussed before. So I see booming markets. So we need to make sure that we get the supply chain disruptions under control, because that was also having an impact on us. This is something I would definitely need to deal with in the next 6 months. I mean, I'm talking half of my time in my external engagements, I'm talking about sustainability. And when I started my jobs just 2 years ago, it was maybe 5 to 10% of my time. So customers are really reaching out to us. They want to get the answers they're looking for. They want to get the support. And this is probably the other important part of my agenda, making sure that we can deliver to that demand we're seeing, but then also making sure that we help our customers, guide our customers, advise our customers. What can they do? Pretty much the same questions you asked me is the questions CEOs of my customers are asking me as well. And then, of course, we need to get much more specific. Okay, what do we now specifically have to offer to you? But the direction of the question is very much in line with the questions you're asking me. And as a senior executive, this is exactly what I do in my interactions, talking about this. And then hopefully we can bring these two things together. Hopefully we can get the supply chain under control, and then really benefit from the booming markets, help customers on their sustainability journey.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Brown, for joining us and for your time this afternoon. I really hope that the solutions that you just discussed would really augment our building block sectors of our economy towards a more sustainable and decarbonized future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for the great conversation. It was my pleasure.